You probably have a scar somewhere on your body that you go months without thinking about. A small white line under your chin from a childhood fall. A faded mark on the inside of your wrist from a kettle when you were 8. The silver crescent on your knee from a bicycle landing badly. On a road you can no longer quite picture. You don't think about it for years. Then someone notices it across a dinner table, or a child finds it in the bath and asks where it came from. And the answer arrives before you can fully think. The kettle, the bike, the dog that was startled, the door that closed faster than your fingers. Most adults carry at least one of these. Some carry several. They are usually small enough that, by the time you are 40, you have stopped including them when someone asks you to describe yourself. But they are still there. Your body has not forgotten anything you have asked it to do. Tonight, a scar like that. Except this one belonged to a boy who was 9. His name was Phillip Phillips. He lived somewhere in or near Merthyr Tydfil, which in 1841 was the largest town in Wales and the largest producer of iron anywhere in the world. The valley made iron out of coal. The coal came out of the hills around the town, and the hills were full of children working in narrow tunnels by the light of cheap oil lamps when the lamps were given to them, and in complete darkness when they were not. Philip was 9 years old when a government inspector named Robert Hugh Franks went down into one of those tunnels to find him. The tunnel belonged to a colliery owned by a man called Anthony Hill, who was considered by the standards of his fellow ironmasters in Merthyr to be one of the better employers in the valley. The colliery sat about 2 miles south of the town, in a network of drifts and shafts that fed the great Plymouth ironworks on the surface. And somewhere inside that network, at a wooden ventilation door in the dark, Philip had a job. His job was to sit beside that door for 12 hours at a time and to open it whenever a coal cart came through, and to close it again the moment the cart had passed. The doors kept the air moving in the right direction through the mine. When they did their work, fresh air reached the men cutting coal at the seam, and the gas in the air did not build up to the level at which it killed people. When they failed, the air went the wrong way. The gas accumulated wherever the work was being done, and the next spark, from a lamp, from a charge being fired, from a piece of struck stone, could bring the roof down on whoever was standing under it. Sitting at the door was the first job a colliery child was usually given. By 1841, Philip had been doing it for some unknown number of years. He was paid a few pennies a day for the work. When Franks reached him, Philip's face was scarred. The scar was almost a year old. Franks took down what Philip told him about how it had got there, and the deposition has been sitting in the parliamentary record since 1842, where it can still be read by anyone who wants to read it. The substance of what Philip said was this. Almost a year before the inspector's visit, there had been an accident in the section he worked. Several of the children, including him, had been burned. He had been carried home by a man whose name he either never knew or did not give. He used a sentence to describe the burn. All the skin was burnt off my face. And then he said, with the plainness of a child who has been asked a direct question, that he could not work for 6 months afterwards. He had been 8 when it happened. When the burns had healed enough that he could walk and see properly, he had come back to the same door in the same colliery. And a year later, when Franks arrived with a notebook, he was still sitting beside it. After the deposition, the document goes quiet. There are too many men named Phillip Phillips in the Welsh census records of every decade after 1841 for any of them to be confidently identified as ours. The whole conversation Franks had with him fits onto less than half a page of a parliamentary volume. We have his face, and we have his sentence, and we have his door, and after that, nothing. Tonight, less than half a page. Before we begin, a small favour. If what you're listening to feels worth being made, the subscribe button does more for a channel like this than almost anything else. And in the comments, I'd like to know something. What's a scar you carry on your body that you go months without thinking about? Not a serious one, just an ordinary mark from an ordinary part of your life that happens to be on your skin. You don't have to say where it came from. I read the answers, and they make me think about how much of what we have lived has nowhere else to live except on us. Now get a little more comfortable. Philip's deposition has been sitting in a bound volume in a London archive for 184 years. It has been read in any given year since 1842 by perhaps a dozen people. It is not in a hurry tonight. The morning we are going to sit with was a Tuesday in late autumn, 1840. The exact date does not survive in any record we have, because Philip was a year away from being interviewed, and nobody who lived in his house or worked in his pit was, on that particular Tuesday, writing anything down. What we know about it, we know from the way mornings of that kind worked, in that part of Wales, in that year, for a boy of his age and his employment. And from the few details that surface almost a year later, when he sat down with the inspector and described what came next. He was 8. He had been working underground for somewhere between 18 months and 3 years. The lower end of that range puts him beginning at 6.5, which is not unusual in the Plymouth depositions. The upper end puts him beginning at 5, which is also not unusual. Either way, by the autumn of 1840, the routines of a working day were no longer new to him, in the sense that nobody had to tell him what to do. He woke up when he was woken up, and he went where he had been going for at least 1 full year of his short life. The waking happened a little before 5. In the houses of colliery families along the streets that ran south from Merthyr toward Pentrabach and Tydfil, the morning began with a man called the caller-out, who walked the lanes with a long pole and tapped on upstairs windows until he saw a candle moving on the other side of the glass. Philip's family would have heard him before they could see him, the tapping carrying through the thin walls of houses that were, in many cases in those years, a single ground-floor room with a sleeping space above it for whichever members of the household could be fitted into the loft. By the time the candle was lit, several people were already awake, and within a quarter of an hour the room would have been moving with the particular slow purpose of a household that has done the same thing in the same order, in the dark, every working day for as long as anyone there can remember. Philip would have been dressed before he was fully awake. There is nothing in the record about what he wore but the depositions of the other Plymouth children and the surviving photographs of mining children from a generation later when photography reached the valleys are consistent enough about it that we can describe it without inventing. A pair of trousers, often cut down from something an older brother had outgrown. A shirt of cheap linen or coarse cotton, sometimes a waistcoat, more often not, a flat cap or no cap. Boots, if the family could afford them, more often clogs with wooden soles and leather uppers, and in some households the youngest children still went down barefoot, because boots cost more than a child's first 6 months of wages were worth, and a barefoot child could be promoted to boots later. Breakfast was bread and whatever else there was. In a working household in Merthyr in 1840, what else there was depended on which day of the week it was relative to payday. On a good morning, 2 days after wages, there was butter on the bread and a piece of cheese the size of a thumb, and tea. Strong, brown, the same leaves used for the 3rd or 4th time. On a bad morning, the day before wages, there was bread on its own and water. The bread was almost always bought from a baker rather than baked at home, because the houses had no proper ovens, only the open fire, and buying bread freed the fire for the one hot meal of the day, which was eaten in the evening. Philip ate standing up or sitting on the edge of whatever was available, and he was finished within a minute or two. Children who worked underground learned early not to eat slowly in the morning, because they learned early not to eat much in the morning at all. A heavy stomach was a punishment in the pit. The midday food, if you had any, was a piece of bread wrapped in a cloth and tied to your belt or pushed into a pocket, and you ate it whenever the hunger became inconvenient, which was usually by 10. The walk from the door of the house to the entrance to the colliery was somewhere between half a mile and a mile, depending on which row the family lived in. In November, the walk was done in full darkness, because the sun was not up at 6 in that latitude in that month, and along the lanes the only light came from the lamps of other workers heading the same way and from the great red glow on the horizon of the Plymouth furnaces, which never went out. The furnaces were always burning, day and night, year-round, because letting them cool meant relining them at enormous expense, and so the only thing in Merthyr that did not sleep was the iron itself. The boy who was walking to look after a door in a coal mine could see the fires that the coal he would not be cutting was, at that moment, feeding, and he had probably been able to see them every morning since he had first walked this route. At the pit head, the boys gathered in small groups under the wooden headgear, talking quietly, the way people talk in the cold before they have eaten enough. Most of them spoke Welsh to each other. Some of them spoke a kind of working English picked up from the foreman and the ironworkers above ground. But among themselves, in 1840, in a Merthyr colliery, the language was Welsh, and the names of things, the door, the cart, the shaft, the seam, existed in 2 languages at once, with the English version used when speaking to anyone above the rank of haulier, and the Welsh version used the rest of the time. Philip was almost certainly bilingual to the extent that an 8-year-old can be bilingual. His mother spoke to him in Welsh. The man who paid him spoke to him in English. Going down was done in a basket, in a cage, or, at the drift entrances Plymouth used for several of its workings, on foot, walking into the side of the mountain along a sloping tunnel that, after about 30 yards, swallowed all daylight and replaced it with whatever light the men were carrying. The deeper workings were reached by shaft, and the deepest shafts at Plymouth, in 1840, went 240 feet down, which is roughly the height of a 20-story building, descended in a wooden cage hung from a hemp rope wound around a steam-powered drum. The cage was not enclosed. There were no sides above the waist. A child going down stood between the legs of the men, gripping a rail, and the descent took something under a minute, during which the temperature rose, the smell changed, and the daylight at the top contracted into a small white dot that blinked out somewhere around the halfway mark. At the bottom, the boys split off toward their own sections. The men went one way, the hauliers and their horses another, the trappers a third. Philip walked, alone or with another boy his age for part of the route, along passages that were sometimes 6 feet high, and sometimes 4, and sometimes, as you got closer to the working face, 3. The deeper Plymouth seams ran narrow. Sections of the workings of a coal mine were never lit by anyone in particular. They were lit only by whoever happened to be passing through, and so the light along a passage came and went, the way headlights come and go on a country road at night, and between the passings, the dark was complete. His door was where it had been the day before. The door was a wooden panel, hinged at one side, weighted at the other, and held shut by a simple counterbalance arrangement. A length of rope ran from the latch up to wherever Philip was sitting, which in his particular section was a small alcove cut into the rock about 3 feet from the door. He sat on a flat stone, or on a small wooden plank if a sympathetic collier had left one for him at some point, and he held the rope in his hand. When he heard a tram coming, the iron wheels carried sound a long way through stone. He pulled the rope, the door opened, the tram passed, and the rope fell loose, and the door swung shut. Between trams there was nothing to do. He sat. He had no lamp. The colliers had lamps. The hauliers had lamps. The horses had small lamps strapped to their harnesses so that the men driving them could see what was in front of the animal. The trappers had no lamps. The reason was not that anyone had decided trappers should sit in the dark as a matter of policy. The reason was that lamp oil cost money, and the men who paid for the oil had decided at some point in the early history of the South Wales coalfield that a child who only needed to listen for a tram and pull a rope did not need to see anything in order to do that. The decision was not announced. It was simply how it was, in the way that many things in 1840 were simply how they were, and a child arriving at a door for the first time learned that the door came without a lamp, the same way he learned that the wage came without a contract, by showing up and finding out. What this meant in practice, and this is something that is difficult to convey without sitting somewhere quiet for a few minutes and trying it, is that for somewhere between 10 and 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, Phillip Phillips experienced a darkness that almost no one in a modern country has ever experienced for more than a few minutes at a stretch. It was not the darkness of a bedroom at night, where your eyes adjust and the shapes of furniture become legible against the slightly less dark window. It was the darkness of 300 feet of rock between you and the sun. It does not adjust. There is nothing for the eyes to adapt to. After a few weeks of it, the children in the depositions described seeing flashes. Not visual flashes exactly, more like the sensation of light without any light being there. And after a few months they stopped mentioning it, because it had become the normal condition of being awake. He sang sometimes when there was a lamp passing close enough that he could see his own knees, but he stopped singing when it left, because singing in the dark in a coal mine when you are 8 is a thing that you only do once before you understand why nobody else does it. By 11 o'clock, the men in his section were getting ready to fire a charge. He could hear them at the face, the scrape of the drill, the murmur of voices, the particular tone in which a collier called for the powder. Charges were fired several times a shift, in a working seam, to break the coal away from the wall so that it could be loaded onto trams. Philip had heard charges fired hundreds of times before. The procedure was familiar. The men shouted a warning down the passage. Anyone in the line of the blast moved further back. The charge went off. The dust rolled along the gallery, and after a minute, the work resumed. He was sitting where he had sat for, by then, perhaps 4 hours. The door was shut. His hand was on the rope. Somewhere beyond the door, in the section where the men were working, the charge was being tamped into a hole in the coal face, and the fuse was being trimmed, and one of the colliers, the man whose name we will never know, was about to call out the warning that would, by the time it reached Philip, no longer matter at all. We will leave him there for a moment. The thing that happens next has been waiting in the deposition for 185 years to be told, and it can wait another paragraph. The charge went off, and what happened in the next several seconds in the Plymouth seam where Phillip Phillips was working has to be reconstructed in pieces, because nobody who was close enough to it to see it clearly was in any condition afterwards to describe it. We have Philip's deposition, and we have the general pattern of small fire-damp ignitions in South Wales pits in the early 1840s, and we have what is known about the physics of a methane pocket meeting an open flame in a confined space. We do not have, anywhere in the surviving documents, a moment-by-moment account of the accident itself. What we have is the shape of it, and the shape is enough. Fire damp is the old miner's word for methane gas, which seeps out of coal seams as the coal is broken open and which, in the right concentration with air, becomes the most explosive gas a working miner is likely to encounter in his life. Below 5% in air, it does nothing. Above 15%, it does nothing because there is too much methane and too little oxygen for it to burn. Between 5 and 15%, and that window is the part of the story that matters. It ignites instantly the moment it meets a spark or a flame, and the flame travels along the gas pocket faster than a person can react to it. If the pocket is small, the result is a flash of fire that licks along the roof for a few feet and burns whoever is standing in its path before it goes out. If the pocket is large, the result is a detonation that can collapse a passage and kill everyone in it, and which, in the dry coal mines of the South Wales valleys with their clouds of fine coal dust hanging in the air, can sometimes propagate from gas to dust and travel along the workings for hundreds of yards, igniting one cloud of dust after another and bringing the roof down behind it as it goes. The Sengenid disaster of 1913, the worst mining accident in British history, which killed 440 men and boys at a single colliery one valley over from where Philip was working, was a chain of exactly this kind of dust ignition. In 1840, in the section where Philip sat by his door, what happened was much smaller, and Philip was lucky in the only sense that he survived it. What he told Franks almost a year later was that there had been an accident, and that most of the workers in his section had been burned, and that he was one of them. He used the phrase, "all the skin was burnt off my face," to describe what had happened to him, which is the kind of phrase a child uses when he is repeating, almost word for word, something he has heard an adult say about him while he was lying somewhere being looked at. Burns to a small child's face in 1840, in a household that had no running water and no medical care beyond what a neighbour with some experience could offer at a kitchen table, were treated with whatever was on hand. Clean water, if there was a clean source, lard or butter rubbed onto the wound, sometimes egg white, sometimes nothing at all. And the survival of the burn depended almost entirely on whether the wound got infected in the first 2 weeks. Phillips did not, or did not badly enough to kill him. By the time the inspector saw him, the burn had healed into the kind of scar that a face carries for the rest of its life. Tight, shiny, paler than the surrounding skin in some places, and darker in others, pulling slightly at the corner of an eye or a mouth depending on where the worst of the heat had landed. The man who carried him out of the pit and home, the one detail of the accident that Philip did mention, almost in passing, would have done so by walking, with the boy in his arms or over a shoulder, along the same passages that Philip had walked into the mine that morning, and then up the shaft or out the drift, and then through whatever streets lay between the colliery entrance and the door of the Phillips house. He may have been the boy's father. He may have been a neighbour, a foreman, a haulier who happened to be in the area, a man Philip had never spoken to before that morning. The deposition does not say, and there is no way to recover it. What the deposition does say is that Philip remembered, a year later, that someone had carried him. The presence of a person who picked him up and got him home matters in a way that is difficult to put into words, because it is the first piece of evidence in his entire surviving record that anyone in the world treated him as something more than a boy who pulled a rope. We do not know who the man was. We know that he existed, and that he stopped what he was doing, and that he picked up an 8-year-old with burns on his face, and that he walked. Philip was not able to work for 6 months afterwards. He says this in one short sentence in the deposition, with the same matter-of-fact tone in which he gives the wages and the hours, and the sentence does several things at once that are worth noticing. It places the accident roughly 6 to 9 months before Franks's visit, which lets us locate it in the autumn or early winter of 1840. It tells us that the burn was severe enough to keep a working child away from work for half a year. which in a household that depended on the wages of every person in it old enough to earn anything was a substantial loss. And it tells us, by what it does not say, that the family found a way through those 6 months. There was no insurance. There was no compensation from the colliery. The Mines Act that would, in theory, have begun to address the conditions in which the accident happened was still nearly 2 years from being passed, and even that act would not have covered injury compensation. Whatever the Phillipses ate during those 6 months, they ate by some combination of his father's wages, his mother's earnings if she did any work outside the home, and the network of small loans, shared loaves, and unspoken accountings that held working-class neighbourhoods together in industrial Wales in 1840. The numbers of the South Wales coalfield in those decades are worth holding in mind here, because they explain why an accident like Phillip's was unremarkable enough to merit only a single line in a single deposition. Between 1880 and 1900, when statistics were finally being kept properly, South Wales accounted for 18% of Britain's miners and 48% of Britain's mining deaths. The proportion in 1840 was almost certainly worse, because the safety legislation that would slowly bring those numbers down had not yet begun to exist. The Welsh coalfield killed its workers at roughly 3 times the rate of the rest of British coal mining for most of the 19th century, and a small ignition that scarred a child's face but did not kill him was the kind of thing that, in the ledger of the period, did not register at all. He came back to work when the burn had healed enough that he could see properly out of both eyes, and walk the distance from his house to the colliery without help. The day he returned is not described anywhere in the surviving record. We can only say that he did return, because a year later when Franks reached him, he was sitting at a ventilation door in the same colliery, doing the same job for the same wage. Whether it was the same door is something the deposition does not tell us. It might have been. The colliery had several sections and several doors, and there is no particular reason to think the foreman would have given much thought to where they put a boy who had recovered from a burn. Whatever sympathy he received, if he received any, was the sympathy of his neighbours. The colliery offered him a rope and a wooden panel, and he took them. The door he had been keeping on the morning of the accident was almost certainly still standing. Ventilation doors were sturdy by design, because the entire ventilation system of the mine depended on them holding their position during a gas event, and a small ignition of the kind that burned Philip would not generally have been violent enough to blow a door off its hinges. The fire would have travelled past the door, on the working side, and then gone out when it ran out of gas. The door would have remained shut, doing the work it had been put there to do, while the boy who had been opening and closing it lay somewhere between the seam and the surface, being carried home. The system that had failed him in one sense had held him in another. The door had kept the air going the right way through the rest of the mine, which meant that the fire did not propagate, which meant that the men who were not in his immediate section were able to walk out of the pit on their own legs at the end of their shift. The door had done its job. He had done his job. The two facts were going to sit uncomfortably beside each other for the rest of his working life. When he sat back down beside it, almost a year later, the burn on his face was visible in any light that reached him. There was very little light that reached him. The lamp situation had not changed. The system Phillip Phillips was sitting inside was older than the colliery he worked in, older than the Plymouth ironworks, older than the town of Merthyr Tydfil in any form a modern visitor would recognise. People had been digging coal out of the South Wales hills since at least the 13th century in the form of small bell pits and hillside drifts that went a few yards into the slope and stopped when the air stopped being breathable. The limit on how far a coal mine could go, for most of human history, was not the price of timber or the strength of the rock or the willingness of men to do the work. It was the air. A coal seam opened up by digging gives off methane. The deeper the seam, the more methane it gives off, because the gas has been held in the coal under the pressure of the rock above it for millions of years, and it comes out the moment that pressure is released. Methane is lighter than air. It rises. In a horizontal passage cut into a hillside, it collects against the roof and sits there until something disturbs it. And what disturbs it, in a working coal mine in 1840, is almost always either the flame of a lamp or the spark of a charge being fired. A pit with no ventilation is a pit that will, sooner or later, kill everyone in it. What ventilation in a coal mine actually means, in practice, is a current of fresh air being pulled through the workings from one shaft to another. One shaft brings air in. The other shaft carries the foul air out. The fresh shaft is called the downcast, the foul shaft the upcast, and the difference between the two is created in the simplest pits by the difference in temperature between the deep workings and the surface, and in the more developed pits by the time the Plymouth collieries were running their deeper levels, by a fire kept burning at the bottom of the upcast shaft. The fire heats the air. The warm air rises up the upcast and out into the sky, and cold air is pulled in down the downcast to replace it. The whole mine is, in this sense, a single, very slow chimney, with men and boys and horses working inside the draft. This works perfectly as long as the mine has only two passages, one going in, one going out, with the air flowing along a single straight route between them. The moment the workings begin to branch, which they do almost immediately because coal is not arranged in straight lines underground, the system breaks down. Air, like water, takes the easiest route. If you cut a side passage off the main one, the air will flow down whichever passage offers it less resistance, and the other passage will get nothing. The coal face at the end of the neglected passage will fill with gas. The men working there will breathe air that is increasingly less air, and increasingly more carbon dioxide and methane. And within a few hours they will start making the kinds of mistakes that come before unconsciousness. And within a few hours after that, they will not be making any decisions at all. The solution that the British coal industry arrived at, by trial and error over the course of the 18th century, was the trapdoor. You install a wooden door across the passage you do not want the air to take, weight it so that it falls shut on its own, and then station someone beside it whose job is to open it whenever a coal cart needs to come through, and to close it the moment the cart has passed. The air, finding the easier passage blocked, flows down the harder one and reaches the working face. The men get their air, the mine continues to function, and the entire system depends, at every junction in the workings, on whether the wooden door beside which a child is sitting is, at any given moment, in the correct position. A medium-sized colliery in 1840 might have between 10 and 30 of these doors scattered through its workings. Each one had a child beside it. The child controlled, in the most direct sense available to the word, whether the men down the passage that door served were going to walk out of the pit at the end of the day or be carried out. And the men down the passage almost never met the child, almost never spoke to the child, in many cases did not know the child's name. The child's existence registered with the working colliers only in the sense that the door swung open when their tram approached and swung shut behind it. Beyond that, the boy at the door was a piece of the ventilation system, in the same way that the upcast fire was a piece of the ventilation system, and the rope and pulley were, and the wooden frame around the shaft was. The colliery did not employ children at the doors because it had a particular philosophy about the role of small workers in industrial life. It employed children because the door did not need to be operated by anyone strong, and because children were cheaper than adults. and because in the Welsh valleys in 1840, there were a very large number of children whose families needed every additional shilling that could be brought into the house. A man at a door would have cost 2 shillings a day. A boy at the same door cost 5 pence. What this meant, in the language of responsibility rather than economics, is something it takes a moment to register properly. Phillip Phillips at his door was the link in the chain that determined whether somewhere between 200 and 500 adult men in his colliery were going to live or die on any given afternoon. The exact number depended on which section his door served and how the workings were laid out at any particular point in the year, but the order of magnitude did not vary. He did not know any of those men. Most of them did not know him. They worked at coal faces a quarter of a mile or more from his alcove. They could not see his door. They had no way of checking, while they were working, whether the door was where it needed to be. They simply trusted, the way you trust a traffic light when you cross a road, that the system was operating, and the system in this case was a child sitting on a flat stone in the dark with a piece of rope in his hand. The closest thing to an equivalent in the world a modern listener lives in is the job of an air traffic controller. An air traffic controller watching screens in a dim room at a regional airport is responsible for the lives of perhaps 1,000 people at any given moment, distributed across the aircraft they are tracking, and the consequences of a serious mistake are catastrophic and immediate. To do the job, an air traffic controller in any developed country in 2026 has completed somewhere between 2 and 4 years of specialized training, passed multiple medical and psychological examinations, served years of supervised apprenticeship under more senior controllers, and is paid in most countries a salary that places them comfortably in the upper half of the national income distribution. They are usually somewhere between 30 and 50 years old. The system that gives them their authority does so on the assumption that the lives they are responsible for can only be safely placed in the hands of an adult who has been carefully prepared for the weight of holding them. Phillip Phillips held a comparable weight in the same fundamental sense with 3 years of working experience, no training, no examination, no apprenticeship, no salary above 5 pence a day, at the age of 9. The shape of the responsibility was the same. The shape of the person it was given to was not. There are records of what happens when the system fails. The records are scattered across coroners' reports and pit disaster inquiries from the 18th and 19th centuries, and many of them follow a pattern so consistent that you can read 3 or 4 of them and predict the rest. A boy at a door becomes drowsy or hungry or curious or scared, and either falls asleep at his post or leaves it for a few minutes to find another child to talk to. The door, being waited to fall shut, generally remains shut while he is gone, and this is in fact part of why the door was weighted that way. But on the occasions when something jams it open, or when the boy props it open to make his own job easier on a quiet afternoon, the air finds the easier path and the working face stops getting fresh air. In one inquest from the 1830s in the north of England, a boy of 8 named Norman left his door propped open to walk down the passage and visit another trapper. The methane built up in the section the door had been ventilating. A charge was fired. The flame met the gas. 34 men died. Norman survived because he was nowhere near them when it happened, and his name appears in the inquest record once, and then, like Phillips, disappears. The men who died had on average 25 years of mining experience between them. They had families. They had homes. They had skills and reputations and individual histories that filled, in some cases, whole lives of work that the inquest barely had room to summarize. They were buried by their wives. The inquest concluded that the cause of death was the boy. Whether the boy understood what he had done in the days and weeks after the accident, The record does not say. There is at least one other case from the same period in which a boy of 9, named Richard Cooper, left his door to play with a boy at an adjoining door, and the same chain of events killed 32 men. The fact that 2 such cases survived in the documentary record, from collieries hundreds of miles apart, suggests that the actual frequency of these accidents was higher than the surviving documents capture, and that most of them were settled without leaving a paper trail beyond a coroner's note and a parish burial entry. A child who killed 30 men was not generally prosecuted because there was no statute under which a child of that age could be charged with the deaths, and because the colliery had an obvious interest in the matter being closed without further inquiry. The boy was usually sent home for a few weeks, and then, as often as not, sent back down to a different door in the same mine. Phillip Phillips, at his door, was inside this system. The men a quarter of a mile away from him were trusting him in a way they did not consciously think about, because they could not have done their work if they had thought about it consciously, with their lives. He was, on the day of the accident in 1840, approximately 3 years and 8 years old respectively in 2 different senses of the word, and the colliery had given him the same job either way. The door he sat beside had been doing the work of holding the air in its proper course for as long as he had been sitting beside it. When he was carried out with burns on his face, the door was still there, still doing its work, and a foreman in the days afterwards must have looked at the empty alcove and made a note somewhere that another child was needed at that station. By the time Philip was well enough to come back, that note had been resolved one way or another, either by his own return or by the placing of a different boy beside him. The system did not care which. What the system did was move air. What the air did was keep men alive. What kept the air doing what it was supposed to do was a wooden panel, weighted to fall shut, and a child holding a rope. The valley where Philip's rope held the air ran roughly north to south along the upper course of the River Taff, and from the top of any of the surrounding hills in 1841, you could see, on a still morning, the smoke of 4 enormous ironworks rising into a single grey ceiling above it. Tydfil was at the northern end of the town, owned by the Crawshay family, the largest of the 4. Dowley sat slightly higher up the eastern slope, owned by the Guests, and was within a few years of becoming the largest ironworks in the world. Penydarren stood between them, smaller, older, the place where, in 1804, Richard Trevithick had run the world's first steam locomotive along a horse-drawn tramway, and confirmed in the process that steam could pull more iron than horses could. And, to the south of all 3, down the valley toward the village of Pentrabash, sat the Plymouth Iron Works, owned by Anthony Hill, where Philip's coal was going. The works had been there since 1763, when an Englishman called Isaac Wilkinson had taken a lease on a piece of land from the Earl of Plymouth and built a single furnace beside the river. The lease is the reason the works took the name they did, which has nothing to do with the city in Devon, and everything to do with the aristocrat who happened to own that particular slope. Wilkinson's venture had failed. The lease had passed to Anthony Bacon, and on Bacon's death in 1788, it had passed to a man called Richard Hill, whose family had been running it ever since. By the time Philip was sitting at his door in 1841, the Hill in charge was Richard's youngest son, also called Anthony, who had been born in 1784 and named after Bacon. Anthony Hill had inherited his father's share in 1806, bought out his brother's shares in stages over the following 20 years, and built the operation into something that, by the mid-1840s, occupied 3 separate sites along 1.5 miles of the river. The original Plymouth furnaces at the north end, a forge at Pentraback in the middle, and a newer set of furnaces at Dyffryn at the southern end. Between them, they ran 10 blast furnaces, 24 puddling furnaces, 4 forges, and 7 rolling mills, and the whole complex employed somewhere around 2,000 men, women, and children, of whom Phillip Phillips was one. To feed the furnaces, Anthony Hill needed coal, and to get coal he needed mines, and the mines were scattered across the hillside above the works, in a pattern that had grown up by accident over the decades as one seam after another had been opened and exploited. Some of the workings were drifts driven horizontally into the slope, following a coal seam wherever it ran. Others were vertical shafts that went straight down through several seams stacked one above the other. The deepest of the Plymouth shafts in 1841 went 240 feet, which was deep by the standards of the valley, but nothing compared to what the South Wales coalfield would be producing 50 years later, when the deep steam coal pits in the Rhondda would be sinking shafts of 2,000 feet and more. The coal at Plymouth came out of 5 different seams of different thicknesses. 2 of them were 36 inches thick, which is roughly the height of a kitchen table. 1 was 48 inches. 1 was 84 inches, which is tall enough to walk in, and 1 was a full 8 feet, which was the seam the colliers liked best, because you could swing a pick in it without lying down. A great deal of the work in the thinner seams was done lying on the side, with the pick swung in short strokes from a few inches above the ground, and a man's working life in those seams tended to end somewhere in his 40s, when his back gave out. Philip's door was somewhere in this network. We do not know which seam, which level, or which junction. The deposition does not say, and the colliery's own internal records, if they ever existed in writing, have not survived. What we know is that he was working in one of the Plymouth pits in 1841, and that Mary Davis and Susan Rees and John Rees, whom we will come to know in their own time, were working in adjacent sections of the same complex, and that Anthony Hill was, in the most direct legal sense available to the word, their employer. Anthony Hill had a reputation in his own lifetime and has retained that reputation in the local historical record as the most humane of the 4 Merthyr ironmasters. The reputation was not invented after his death. It was earned in his lifetime by a series of decisions that his contemporaries noticed and remarked on. He built proper houses for his workers in Pentrabach and Tydfil, of 2 stories with separate sleeping rooms, at a time when many of his neighbours' workers were still living in single-room cottages or sharing lofts. He built a national school in Pentrabach in 1842 and paid the teachers' salaries out of his own pocket, at a time when there was no public obligation on a colliery owner to educate the children of his workforce. He built a church beside the school and endowed it with £200 a year for the upkeep of the priest. When he died in 1862, he left a sum of money in his will to fund a scholarship that would pay the secondary school fees of children of Plymouth Works employees who showed academic promise. And the Anthony Hill Scholarship is, as of this recording, still being awarded. Welsh students attending the local grammar schools today are still receiving small grants from a fund set up by the man who employed Phillip Phillips at a wooden door in the dark. The reputation was also accurate in comparison to his peers. Anthony Hill was, by all surviving accounts, less brutal than William Crawshay, less politically reactionary than Josiah John Guest, less involved in the truck system than either of them. He paid his workers in cash more often than not. He did not own the local shops. When his men struck for higher wages, which they did periodically through the 1830s and 1840s, he negotiated rather than hiring strikebreakers. The historians of Merthyr who have written about him over the past century and a half have generally settled on the same word to describe him, which is paternalistic, and the word is doing a great deal of work in those sentences because it is meant to communicate that Anthony Hill regarded his workforce as a kind of extended family for whom he was personally responsible, and that he behaved within the limits of what a Merthyr ironmaster could do in a manner consistent with that view. And in the same year, in the same complex, in the workings that fed the furnaces of the man who built the school and the church and the scholarship fund, 90 boys, 25 girls, and 80 grown women were working underground. The numbers come from Anthony Hill's own returns to the Children's Employment Commission, submitted through his agent Thomas Josephs in 1841. The boys ranged in age from 6 to 13. The girls ranged from 9 to 13. The women ranged from 16 to 50. They were doing the same work the men were doing in many cases, pushing trams, dragging loaded baskets, carrying tools, working as drammers and hauliers and doorkeepers. And they were being paid roughly half of what an adult man received for comparable work. And their existence in the workings was, as far as the record shows, never something Anthony Hill regarded as a contradiction with the school he had built, or the church he had endowed, or the houses he had constructed. There is no surviving letter, no recorded conversation, no entry in any of his agent's books in which he addresses the question of why the children of the workers he was educating in Pentrabach were also being employed by him in coal seams a mile away. The question does not seem to have arrived in his consciousness in a form that required an answer. The children at the doors were a feature of the colliery the way the timber props were a feature of the colliery, and the school in Pentrabach was a separate enterprise, and the relationship between them was not a problem that needed to be solved because it was not perceived as a problem. Both things were true. They were true at the same time. The school stood on its hillside and educated some children, and the mines under the same hillside employed others, and the same man was paying for both, and the two facts coexisted without abrasion in the moral universe of an early Victorian ironmaster. The historians who have looked closely at Anthony Hill's life have generally not tried to resolve this contradiction, because resolving it would require either softening his good works into a kind of cynical public relations, which the surviving evidence does not support, or hardening his employment of children into a deliberate cruelty, which the surviving evidence also does not support. What the evidence supports is that he was a man of his time who genuinely believed himself to be doing well by his workers, and who genuinely was by the standards of his neighbours, and that the standards of his neighbours included the routine employment of 6-year-olds in coal mines, and that he never appears to have noticed the gap between what he was proud of and what he was paying for. From the top of the mountain above Pentrabach, on a still autumn morning in 1841, the smoke from the furnaces of Plymouth, Tydfil, Penydarren and Dowlais all rose into the same sky. They made one cloud over the whole valley, lit from below by the constant red glow of the blast furnaces, and the cloud was visible from 40 miles away on the coast. The iron underneath that cloud was being shipped down the Taff to Cardiff, and from Cardiff to London and Bristol and Plymouth, and from those ports to America and India and Russia, and the rails of half the world were being rolled in the mills below. Somewhere in the workings under that mountain, a 9-year-old with a scarred face was sitting beside a wooden door, holding a rope in the dark, and the door was keeping the air going to the men whose coal was making the iron, whose smoke was making the cloud. The whole arrangement was visible from the hilltop. It was not commented on. It was simply how the valley worked. Mary Davis was working at a door perhaps 200 yards from his. She was almost 7 years old in 1841, 6.5 by the inspector's count, possibly a little older by her own. And she had been doing the same job Philip was doing for somewhere around 6 months at the time Robert Hugh Franks reached her. The story of how Franks reached her is the most remembered passage in the entire South Wales section of the Children's Employment Commission, because of the particular thing he found when he got there. He had been walking along a passage in one of the Plymouth workings with a foreman or an agent leading the way, and he had come around a turn and seen, by the light of the lamp he was carrying, a small girl asleep against a piece of fallen rock beside a ventilation door. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her own lamp, on the ground beside her, had gone out. Franks bent down and woke her, and she sat up, blinking, and he asked her what she was doing there. She told him, in a voice that he later recorded as more matter-of-fact than apologetic, that she had been hungry, that her bread and cheese had gone missing while she was at her door. She thought it had been the rats or perhaps somebody passing, and that she had given up waiting for the next tram and gone to sleep. Her lamp had gone out for want of oil at some point during the sleep. She did not know how long she had been there. She knew she had been working since 6 in the morning, and she thought it was now somewhere in the afternoon, but she had no way of telling the time, and the inspector did not, in his published account, tell her what hour it was. The image of a child asleep underground beside a dead lamp, having lost her food to rats and given up trying, became one of the lines through which the British public, reading the report when it was published in May 1842, understood for the first time what was actually being done to children in the country's coal mines. Lord Ashley quoted Mary Davis directly when he stood up in the House of Commons to introduce the bill that would become the Mines Act, and the Chamber, by all accounts of the speech, went very quiet. The girl who had described her bread and cheese in a passage at Plymouth a year earlier did not know that she had been quoted. She would not know, almost certainly, for the rest of her life. Whether she could read at all is unclear. Whether anyone in her household could read out the relevant pages of Hansard to her in the years after the speech is something we have no way of recovering. What she had said in her single moment in the surviving record helped to pass the law that took her out of the mine. A few hundred yards from where Franks found her, Susan Rees was working at another door. Susan was 6. She had been working underground for 6 or 8 months, by her own count when the inspector reached her, which placed the start of her employment somewhere in the late spring of 1841, and made her either 5 or 6 on the day she first went down. Her testimony was more straightforward than Mary's, in part because she had not been asleep when Franks found her, and her surviving sentences are the kind a self-possessed small child gives when she has been asked direct questions by a serious adult. She had been below for about half a year. She did not like it much. She came at 6 in the morning and left at 6 at night, and when her lamp went out or she got hungry, she ran home. The running home is the detail that sits oddly in her account because it suggests a degree of freedom that the other Plymouth depositions do not corroborate, and it may simply have been something she said because she wished it were true. She added, almost as an afterthought, that she had not been hurt yet. Her brother, John Rees, was 8 and worked at the coalface rather than at a door. He had been there for a year. He carried his father's tools, filled the trams with the coal his father had cut or blasted down, and went home with him at the end of the shift. His own deposition is shorter than Susan's. He went to school for a few days, he said, and learned his ABC. The school was almost certainly a Sunday school in one of the Pentrabach chapels, because the national school Anthony Hill would build the following year did not exist when John was getting his few days of education, and because Sunday school literacy was the kind of literacy a colliery boy of 8 was likely to encounter in 1841 if he encountered any at all. Whatever he had learned, it had not extended much beyond the alphabet. He could not read the report his words appeared in. He did not know the report was being compiled. He knew that a man called Mr. Franks had asked him questions in a section of the mine where he was filling a tram, and that he had answered the questions, and that the man had written his answers down in a book. Beyond the 3 of them, in different sections of the same colliery, the deposition record names others. Mary Reed, 12 years old, working at another ventilation door. Henrietta Franklin, 11, dragging trams of coal by a chain attached to her waist, along a low passage between the working face and the roadway where the horses could take over. Evan Gray, 16, who had started underground at the age of 7 and had lost 2 toes in an accident the year before. Each of them appears in the record in a few lines, and each of them was, on the morning Philip went back to his door after his recovery, working somewhere in the same workings, doing some version of the same job, for some version of the same wage. The Plymouth complex was not a quiet place underground. It was full of children. Most of them were younger than Philip. Most of them, in fact, were younger than 9. The standard pattern of a colliery child's career in 1841, in South Wales as in most of the British coalfields, was to start at the doors at 5 or 6 and to be promoted off them by the time you turned 10. The promotion was not formal. There was no ceremony. What happened was that a foreman walking past a child whose voice had begun to break or whose shoulders had begun to fill out would notice that the boy was getting too big for the alcove beside the door and would reassign him at the start of a new week to driving a horse or pulling a tram or carrying tools at the face. Trappers were almost always small. The work did not require any strength beyond what was needed to pull a rope, and the alcoves cut into the rock beside the doors were sized for children, not for adolescents. By the time a boy was 12, he was usually too tall to fit comfortably into the space and too useful for heavier work to be left there. The promotion usually came before the boy was 10, and almost always before he was 12, and a 13-year-old still working at a door was unusual enough that it would be remarked on by the men in the section. Philip, at 9, was at the upper end of the trapper age range. The youngest children Franks encountered at the Plymouth doors were 5.5. The youngest he encountered anywhere in the South Wales coalfield was 4 years and 10 months. The job was a child's first job. The promotion out of it was, more often than not, the second. What this means in practice, when you sit with it for a moment, is that the ordinary Welsh trapper of 1841 was not a 12-year-old. The popular image of the Victorian child miner, the one that has come down through Dickensian illustration and political cartoon and museum diorama, tends to age the child upward into a recognizable late childhood figure, a boy who could conceivably be carrying a satchel to school in a different country. The actual children at the doors were younger than that. They were the age of children who, in a modern household, are still being read to at bedtime, still losing first teeth, still asking how clouds work. Mary Davis was the age of a child going into year 2. Susan Rees was the age of a child in year 1. The boy who killed 34 men in the inquest from the previous chapter was 8. The boy who killed 32 was 9. Phillip Phillips was 9. The valley was full of these children, and they were not the older children of the popular image. They were small. There is no record of whether Philip and Mary ever spoke to each other. They worked in adjacent sections of the same colliery, perhaps a short walk apart along a low passage, and they almost certainly passed each other every morning at the pit head before they went down their separate routes into the dark. They may have nodded. They may have known each other's names. They were the age at which children in any other circumstance would have played together, and they may have, on Sundays, in the lanes of Pentrabach. The deposition does not say. What we have is 2 children in the same place at the same time, doing the same job for the same employer, both of them under 10, both of them keeping the air alive for men they did not know, and one of them, without ever finding out, saying the words that would help to make the other one's job illegal in less than 2 years' time. She had been 7 years old once. He had been 7 years old once. They were both still 7 years old, somewhere underneath the work they were doing, when they sat at their separate doors in the dark. What they were paid for sitting in the dark was, in Philip's case, somewhere between 4 and 5 pence a day. The exact figure does not appear in his deposition, but the going rate for trappers at the Plymouth collieries in 1841, established from cross-referencing the wages of other named children in the same returns, was 4.5 on average, slightly less than the 5 that drammers like Henrietta Franklin received for hauling trams along low passages, and substantially less than the 9 to 12 a day a boy could earn once he had been promoted to driving horses or assisting at the face. The colliery was paying him for the position he occupied, not for the responsibility he carried, and the position of trapper in the colliery's accounting was the lowest paid kind of underground work because it required nothing of the body beyond presence. He sat. He pulled a rope. The colliery had no line item in its books for the weight of what would happen if he stopped doing either of those things. 5 in 1841 in an industrial Welsh town would buy you a small loaf of bread with a little change left over. The English penny in that period was a heavy copper coin about the size of a modern 50p piece, and a working-class household budgeted in pennies the way a modern household budgets in tens of pounds. A pound of butter cost between 8 and 10p. A pound of cheese, 4 to 6. A pound of bacon, 6 to 8. Tea, which was the universal working-class stimulant of the era, cost between 3 and 6 shillings a pound depending on quality, which is to say between 36 and 72p, which is to say more than a trapper's weekly earnings for a single pound of leaves. Most colliery families used the same tea leaves 4 or 5 times before throwing them out, brewing each pot weaker than the last, and the family conversation about whether the tea had any taste left in it by Friday morning was a conversation that almost every Welsh working-class household in that period was having on roughly the same schedule. Philip's weekly earnings, working the standard 6 days a week, came to around 2 shillings and 3p, 27p in the duodecimal English currency of the period. His father, if his father was a collier, would have been earning somewhere between 18 and 24 shillings a week, depending on the seam he was working and the rates the colliery was paying that month. Philip's wages were therefore around 10 to 15% of the household income, which in absolute terms was small and in relative terms was indispensable, because the difference between a working-class Welsh household with 5p a day coming in from a child and the same household without that 5p a day was, in a bad week, the difference between 3 meals on the table and 2. The economics of why a 9-year-old was sitting beside a wooden door in a coal mine in Pentrabach in 1841 are not mysterious. They are not even particularly Welsh. They are the economics that put children to work in cotton mills in Lancashire, in match factories in London, in the silver mines of Potosi 3 centuries earlier, and on the cocoa farms of West Africa today. A household that cannot quite cover its costs with the work of its adults will put its children to work as well, because the alternative is hunger, and hunger comes for everyone in the household, including the children who would otherwise have stayed home. What complicates the picture in 1841 South Wales, beyond the simple equation of a poor family doing what poor families do, is the way the wages were paid. The system the British coal industry had developed for paying its workers was called the truck system, and it was the subject of one of the central political grievances of the Welsh working class in the decades around 1840. Under the truck system, an ironmaster or colliery owner paid his workers partly in cash and partly in vouchers redeemable only at a shop owned by the company. The company shop, which in Welsh was called the Tommy shop, sold flour, bacon, tea, cloth, candles, soap, and most of the other things a working-class household needed, and it sold them at prices set by the company. There was no competing shop a worker could take his vouchers to. There was, in many cases, not much practical alternative for a worker to take his cash wages to either, because the company shop was the only shop within walking distance of the colliery in many of the more remote valleys. And because workers in debt to the company shop, which most of them were most of the time, had their cash wages reduced by whatever they owed before the wages were handed over. The Truck Act of 1831 had made the system illegal in theory, requiring all wages to be paid in coin of the realm, and the Act had been one of the few legislative responses to the Merthyr Rising of that same summer. In practice, the Act was widely ignored throughout the Welsh coalfield for the following 30 years, and the prosecution of an ironmaster for truck violations was rare enough to make local newspapers when it happened. Anthony Hill was, by the standards of the Merthyr ironmasters, less aggressive in his use of truck than the Crawshays at Tydfil or the guests at Dowlais. He paid in cash more often than he paid in vouchers. He kept his prices at the company shop closer to market rates than his competitors did, and he was known to extend small credits to workers in trouble without the punitive interest that some of the other ironmasters charged. None of this made him a benefactor. It made him, in the local phrase that captured something the historians have not been able to improve on, less bad than the others. Philip's 5p a day, when it came home in a mixture of small copper coins and shop credit. And the credit was worth less than the coins, because the coins could be spent anywhere, and the credit could only be spent in one place at one set of prices. There is a particular kind of arithmetic that a household in this position learns to do without consciously thinking about it, and it is worth pausing on for a moment because it shapes the texture of every working-class life of the period. A loaf of bread bought at the company shop on credit might cost 5.5p. The same loaf of bread bought at the independent baker in Merthyr town might cost 4.5. A pound of bacon at the company shop, 6.5p. At the Merthyr market, 5. A yard of cotton cloth for a child's shirt, 14p at the shop, 10 at the market. The mathematics of a workforce being paid partly in vouchers, redeemable only at a shop charging 20% above market, is not subtle. It is a way of clawing back about a fifth of the wages a worker thinks he is earning, and over the course of a working life it accumulates into something substantial. Philip's 5p a day allocated through the truck system was effectively 4p a day in real value. The man who had built the school in Pentrabash was, through the same operation, taking back roughly a fifth of what he was paying the parents of the children attending it. What the wages bought, when they got home, was the most basic possible diet for a colliery family in 1841. Bread 3 meals a day, with some kind of grease for 2 of them. A hot meal in the evening, usually a stew or broth made with potatoes, a small piece of bacon, cabbage or leeks when in season, and whatever herbs the kitchen garden produced. Oatmeal for breakfast on the days oats were cheap. Tea, weak, brewed in a pot that had not been emptied since the previous day. Meat in any quantity was a Sunday occurrence at best. Fresh milk was a luxury most colliery households did not encounter, because the dairies sold their milk to the wealthier households of the town, and what reached the working-class streets was usually skimmed of its cream and watered before sale. Children of Philip's age in his class of household were chronically short of calories, chronically short of iron, chronically short of vitamin D from the daylight they were not seeing, and the cumulative effect on their bodies showed up in the medical inspections that some of the parishes were beginning to conduct in the 1840s. Short stature, soft bones, weak teeth, the particular kind of lasting pallor that comes from years of inadequate food in inadequate light. The economics that produced Philip Phillips at his door in 1841 are not, however, locked in 1841. They are still operating in different valleys, in different countries, on different children, today. As of the latest figures published by the International Labour Organization, there are approximately 138 million children in paid work somewhere in the world, of whom roughly 79 million are in what the ILO classifies as hazardous work. Work that risks injury, disease, or death. A substantial fraction of them are working in mining. The cobalt mines of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which supply the rare earth element that makes the rechargeable batteries in modern phones and laptops and electric cars possible, employ children as young as 6 in conditions that the older Welsh trappers would have recognised in most of their essentials. The mica mines of Jharkhand in eastern India, which produce the mineral that gives cosmetics their shimmer, similarly employ children of primary school age in narrow tunnels with poor ventilation and intermittent light. The coal mines of Pakistan, of Colombia, of Indonesia employ children in roles directly comparable to the ones Philip and Mary occupied. The economics that put a Welsh child at a ventilation door in 1841, a household just below the threshold of being able to manage on adult wages, an industry willing to pay marginally less for a smaller body, the absence of effective enforcement of whatever laws nominally prohibit the practice, is the same economics that puts a Congolese child at a cobalt face in 2026. The technology has moved on. The structure of the work has not. This is not a comparison that should be made too often or too long, because the differences between any two children in any 2 centuries are in many respects as important as the similarities. But the economics is the economics, and the structure is the structure, and there is no way to tell the story of Phillip Phillips honestly without observing that his job exists today, in places we know about and places we do not, and that the smartphone in the pocket of the listener falling asleep to this recording is connected by a supply chain that nobody fully traces, to a child of about Philip's age sitting in conditions of about Philip's kind, somewhere in the world tonight. The 5 pence a day went into a small purse, or a pocket, or sometimes directly into the hand of the boy's mother at the door when he came home, and from there it went into the family's running calculation of what the week could afford. The parish records of St. Tydfil's for 1841 list, household by household, the families in Merthyr who received poor relief that year. The Phillipses are not on the list. Whatever Philip earned, his family was getting by without official charity. 5 pence a day was, in this sense, working. What the wages bought, in the last analysis, was a place to come home to. The houses in which the colliery families of Merthyr lived in 1841 had been built fast, in long terraces, by men who knew how to put up the cheapest possible structure that would not collapse for at least 1 generation. And they had been built in a hurry because the population of the town had nearly doubled in 20 years, and there had been nowhere for the new arrivals to live. The streets ran straight where the slope allowed it and bent where the slope did not, and the houses on each street were almost identical to each other and almost identical to the houses on the next street, with single doors opening onto the lane, sash windows on either side of the door, and a sloping slate roof that took the rain off into a gutter, and from there into whatever drainage the parish had managed to install or had not bothered to. The cottage at 4 Chapel Row in the area of Merthyr called Georgetown has survived since the 1820s and is now a small museum. It was built by the Crawshay family for the workers at their Cyfarthfa ironworks, on a slightly better specification than the housing that the Plymouth works built for its labourers a mile to the south, because Crawshay was wealthier than Hill, and because skilled puddlers, whom 4 Chapel Row was meant to house, were valuable enough to be given 2 stories instead of 1. The cottage as it stands today has a kitchen and front room downstairs and a single bedroom upstairs, accessed by a narrow wooden stair with an outdoor privy at the back. A man called Daniel Parry lived in it in 1841 with his wife and their newborn son, a boy named Joseph, who would grow up to become the most celebrated Welsh composer of the 19th century. Joseph Parry was born in 4 Chapel Row in May 1841, which is to say in the same season that Robert Hugh Franks was walking around the Plymouth pits, taking down the testimonies of small children, and the Parry family's circumstances at the time of his birth are roughly representative of the better end of Merthyr's working-class housing. Philip Phillips's family almost certainly did not live in a house as good as the Parrys. The boy at the door of a Plymouth pit was the son of, at most, an unskilled or semi-skilled colliery worker, and the housing the hill estate provided to its labourers, and the housing the surrounding private landlords provided to families who lived outside the company estate, was rougher, smaller, and more crowded. The 1841 Welsh census and the parliamentary surveys of urban housing conducted in the same decade are consistent with each other on the headline numbers for Merthyr, and the headline number that matters most for understanding what Philip walked home to is this. In the older streets of the town, in the ironworkers' quarters that had grown up between the four big works in the 1820s and 1830s, more than 1,500 families were living in single rooms. The rooms had been measured. They averaged 4 feet 6 inches by 7 feet. That is roughly 1 1/3 meters by just over 2. Smaller than a modern parking space, smaller than the floor area of a queen-size bed, plus a narrow strip of walking room beside it, smaller than the bathroom in most modern flats. Into that space, more than 1,500 Merthyr families were fitting an average of 5 people, including the bed they slept on, and the table they ate at, and the fireplace they cooked over, and whatever shelving and storage they had been able to construct or acquire. The rooms were not all on the ground floor. Some of them were attic spaces under the slope of a roof, accessed by a ladder or a steep stair, with the rain audible directly overhead in the bad seasons. Some of them were back rooms in larger houses subdivided to take in lodgers. Some of them were cellar rooms below street level, with the only window opening onto a light well and the floor permanently damp because the groundwater rose during winter, and the parish drainage did nothing to keep it out. The Phillipses, at 5 pence a day from a child and a colliery wage from a father, would have been living in something at the lower end of this range. The room would have had a fireplace, a single bed which the parents and the youngest children shared, while the older children slept on a mattress on the floor or on a bench against the wall, a small table, perhaps a chair or two, and shelving for whatever crockery and clothing the household possessed. There would have been a chamber pot for night use because the privy in the yard was shared by several families and was not somewhere a 6-year-old could safely visit in the dark. There would have been a tin bath hung on a nail on the wall, brought down once a week for the Saturday night washing. Light came from the fire and from candles or, more often, rushlights. Strips of dried river rush soaked in mutton fat, which burned for about 20 minutes each and produced a feeble yellow flame that smoked and smelled, but was significantly cheaper than a tallow candle. A working-class household budgeted its evening reading and sewing and conversation around how many rushlights it could afford to burn that night, and the answer in most Merthyr households in 1841 was, not many. The fire did most of the work, and the fire was kept low because coal, the very substance Philip had spent his day controlling the air for, deep underground, was expensive at the surface for those who did not get an allowance from their employer, and the Plymouth works did not extend free coal allowances to its trapper boys' families. The walk home from the pit, on the autumn evenings of the year Philip came back to work after his accident, would have been done in full darkness for most of the months, from October through to March. He came up the shaft, walked the half-mile or so home, and arrived at a door behind which his mother was usually waiting. The first thing that happened in colliery households across the British coalfield was the washing of the boy's face and hands. Coal dust gets into every pore in a way that ordinary dirt does not, and a child coming home from 12 hours underground was completely black, except for the whites of his eyes and the pink of his tongue, when he opened his mouth to breathe. The face was washed first, in a tin basin beside the fire, with water that had been heated in a pot on the hob. The hands were washed second. The clothes were generally not changed until Saturday, because changing them every day would have meant washing them every day, and the household had neither the soap, nor the time, nor the indoor space for daily laundry. The boy ate his evening meal still in his working trousers, with his face and hands clean, and the rest of him still smelling of the pit. The evening meal in a Merthyr colliery household in 1841 was the one substantial moment of the day when food was the central concern, and the cooking was almost always done by the mother or by an older daughter. A pot went on the fire in the late afternoon, before the working members of the family came home, and into the pot went whatever the household had managed to acquire that day or that week. Potatoes always, because potatoes were the cheapest filling food a Welsh family could buy. Cabbage or leeks when they were in season, a small piece of bacon for fat and flavour, oatmeal or barley to thicken the broth. Herbs from the kitchen garden if the household had a kitchen garden, which most colliery families in the older streets did not. The pot simmered for an hour or two and was served into bowls with bread on the side. Philip would have eaten this meal sitting at the table or on a stool beside it, with his parents and his siblings in the light of the fire, and a single rushlight if a rushlight was burning that evening. The conversation in his household would have been in Welsh. Welsh was the first language of most of Merthyr's working class in 1841. The town had been overwhelmingly Welsh-speaking when it was a small market settlement at the beginning of the century, and the rapid industrial expansion of the previous 40 years had not changed that majority, because most of the new workers had come in from the surrounding rural Welsh-speaking counties. Carmarthenshire, Cardiganshire, Pembrokeshire, the western parts of Glamorgan, and had brought their language with them. English was the language of the ironmasters, the colliery agents, the foremen above a certain level, the magistrates, the doctors, the Anglican clergy, and the printed notices posted on the walls of public buildings. Welsh was the language of everything else. It was the language a colliery boy spoke to his mother when he came home, the language his father swore in when something went wrong with the dinner pot, the language the old men spoke around the table when they came in from the public house, the language his grandmother had sung to him when he was small. It was also the language of the chapel. Religion in industrial Merthyr in 1841, for the Welsh-speaking working class, meant nonconformity, which is the umbrella term for the Protestant denominations that had separated from the established Church of England over the previous 2 centuries, and which had become, by the early Victorian period, the dominant religious culture of working-class Wales. Whether the Phillipses were Calvinistic Methodists, Independents or Baptists is something the deposition does not say, and the parish records of Merthyr are not detailed enough at this period to tell us with certainty. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that they belonged to one of the 3, because the great majority of Welsh-speaking working-class families in the town did, and that they attended chapel on Sunday morning, and most likely on Sunday evening as well. The chapel was the centre of working-class Welsh life, in a way that has no exact modern equivalent. It was the church, the school, the choir practice, the meeting hall, the welfare society, the lending library, the place where families saw each other every week and knew each other's news, and helped each other through bad weeks. The Sunday school attached to the chapel was, for many colliery children, the only formal education they ever received, and what they learned there was reading. They read the Welsh Bible, which had been translated by Bishop Morgan in 1588 and had been reprinted in cheap editions throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and a basic grasp of arithmetic and the hymns, of which the working-class Welsh repertoire was vast and was sung from memory by entire chapels in four-part harmony of a quality that visiting English clergy regularly remarked upon. What John Rees had said to Franks about going to school for a few days and learning his ABC was almost certainly a description of a Sunday school. The fact that Philip's deposition does not mention any schooling at all does not necessarily mean he had received none. Franks did not always ask, and the boys did not always volunteer information beyond what they were directly asked. It is possible that Philip had attended a Sunday school for some period before he started underground, or in the periods when he was off work, including the 6 months of his recovery from the burn. It is equally possible that he had not, and that the only reading and writing he ever encountered in his life was the lettering on the side of the colliery's tools and the names painted above the doors of the chapel and the public house at the end of his street. We do not know. The deposition is silent on the question. The parish records do not list him by name in any of the school registers that survive, and the censuses of the following decades carry too many men with his name for any one of them to be confidently identified with the boy. By 8 or 9 in the evening, the meal was finished, the dishes were rinsed in cold water and stacked, and the household was preparing to sleep. The youngest children went first, into the single bed against the wall, where they slept 3 or 4 to a mattress with the parents at one end. Philip, at 9, was old enough that he might have slept on a separate mattress on the floor, possibly shared with a sibling, possibly not. The fire was banked down so that it would still be warm in the morning. The rushlight, if there was one burning, was extinguished. The room went dark, properly dark, because the houses of the colliery streets had no street lighting outside their doors, and the moon, when it was visible at all through the smoke of the 4 ironworks, did not throw enough light through a single small window to see by. Philip would have been asleep within minutes. He had been awake for 16 hours, 12 of them at the door. He had 4 hours left before the caller out came back round with the long pole and tapped on the upstairs windows, and the candle would be lit, and the same day would begin again. The street he slept in had a history that had not, in 1841, even begun to be written down properly. Most of the houses had gone up in the 1820s. The cobbles outside his door had been walked over, by 1841, for less than 20 years. And 10 summers before Philip was born, the same street had been the centre of the largest working-class insurrection that Britain had ever seen. The summer was 1831. The trigger was a wage cut. William Crawshay, who owned the Cyfarthfa works at the northern end of the town, had announced in early May that he was reducing the wages of his ironworkers by a substantial margin in response to a slump in iron prices, and within days he had also dismissed 84 puddlers. The skilled men who converted pig iron into wrought iron and who occupied the highest paid working-class position in the entire Merthyr economy. The dismissals and the cuts together affected several thousand workers and their families in a town where the 4 ironworks were the only significant source of employment, and the response was not the kind of grumbling resignation that wage cuts had typically produced in earlier decades. What had changed was the political climate. In London, throughout the early months of 1831, Parliament was debating the Reform Bill, the first serious attempt to extend the parliamentary franchise beyond the small landowning class that had dominated British political life for centuries. And the bill had captured the imagination of working people across the country in a way that earlier reform movements had not. In Merthyr, the workers had been holding mass meetings in support of reform on the moors above the town for months. The meetings had been addressed by speakers of various political tendencies, and the rhetoric in those meetings had drawn freely on the language of the recent revolutions in France and Poland, which had occurred the previous summer and which had been followed in the Welsh press in considerable detail. By the spring of 1831, The working population of Merthyr was politicised to a degree that no Welsh industrial town had been before, and Crawshay's wage cuts arrived into a community that was no longer in the mood to absorb them quietly. The actual rising began on the last day of May, when bailiffs from the Court of Requests, the local debt collection court that had been set up in 1809 specifically to enforce the seizure of property from working-class debtors, and which by 1831 had become one of the most hated institutions in the town, went to the cottage of a man called Lusin Ur Heliwa, Lewis the huntsman, in the village of Penderyn near Merthyr, to take his goods in payment of a small debt. Lewis refused. His neighbours stood with him. The bailiffs left with only a single trunk and the understanding that they had narrowly avoided a beating. The following morning, the 1st of June, marches began in several parts of the valley. By the 2nd of June, there were perhaps 10,000 people in the streets of Merthyr, and the Court of Requests had been broken into and its records burned in the middle of the town. By the 3rd, the workers had effectively taken control of the town and were governing it themselves, and a detachment of soldiers, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, brought in from the garrison at Brecon, had arrived at the Castle Hotel, where the magistrates and the ironmasters had taken refuge to face them. What followed at the Castle Hotel on the morning of the 3rd of June is one of the moments around which the modern history of the Welsh working class is built. The crowd outside the hotel was estimated at between 7,000 and 10,000. Several of them were carrying improvised weapons, and many of them were unarmed. They demanded the abolition of the Court of Requests, the restoration of the wages, and several broader reforms. The magistrates inside the hotel refused to negotiate. The Highlanders were drawn up across the front of the building. At some point, the accounts differ on exactly how and on who threw the first stone. The front of the crowd surged forward, the soldiers fired, and within a few minutes, somewhere between 16 and 24, workers were dead in the street outside the hotel, with another 70 or so wounded. The crowd did not disperse. It regrouped, drove the soldiers off, and held the town against further military attempts to reoccupy it for the next 3 days. On the 4th and 5th of June, the workers ambushed a yeomanry detachment at Hirwaun and disarmed them, captured a consignment of ammunition being moved up the Brecon Road, and set up barricades on the main approaches to the town. They sent delegations to the iron towns of Monmouthshire to call for a wider rising, and on the 6th of June, a crowd of perhaps 12,000 workers from the Monmouthshire valleys marched on Merthyr to join them. A red flag, a sheet that had been dipped in the blood of a slaughtered calf and lifted on a wooden pole, was carried at the head of one of the marches. It was the first time in British history that a red flag had been raised as the symbol of a workers' insurrection. It would be another 17 years before Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels would publish the Communist Manifesto. The Welsh got there first. Their flag was the colour of the only red dye their kitchens contained. The rising was crushed in the following week by the deployment of overwhelming force. Hundreds of additional troops were brought in from the garrisons at Brecon, Cardiff and Bristol. The workers, who had no central command and no plan beyond the holding of the town, were dispersed by a combination of arrests, exhaustion, and the simple impossibility of feeding 10,000 people on the streets of a town that had stopped functioning. By the 2nd week of June, the town was back under official control and the trials began. 28 men and women were charged. Most were sentenced to transportation to the penal colonies of New South Wales. Lusin Ur Heliwa among them, who would die in Port Macquarie in 1847, never having seen Wales again. 2 were sentenced to death. 1 had his sentence commuted. The other was a young miner of 23, named Richard Lewis, known as Dick Penderyn, who was charged with stabbing a soldier of the Highlanders during the confrontation at the Castle Hotel. 11,000 people in Merthyr signed a petition for his release. Witnesses testified that they had seen the actual stabbing and that Dick Penderyn had not been the man who did it. The judge declined to admit the testimony. Dick Penderyn was hanged at Cardiff Market on the 13th of August 1831. His last words, spoken in Welsh on the scaffold, were, "O Arglwyd, dyma gamwed." Oh Lord, what an injustice. 43 years later, in 1874, a Welshman who had emigrated to America after the Rising made a deathbed confession to a congregational minister visiting him in his final illness. His name was Ianto Parker. He confessed that he had been the man who had stabbed the soldier outside the Castle Hotel on the 3rd of June, 1831, and that he had fled to America when Dick Penderyn was arrested for the crime, and that he had carried the knowledge with him for the rest of his life, that an innocent man had been hanged in his place. The minister recorded the confession. It was published in Welsh and in English in the years that followed. It did not bring Dick Penderyn back. The case was reopened by a Welsh Labour MP in 2015, who presented a petition to the House of Commons calling for a posthumous pardon. The pardon, as of this recording, has not been granted. The town Phillip Phillips was born into was the town that had held against the British Army for a week and lost. His parents had lived through it. His mother, in particular, would have been somewhere in or near the town on the 3rd of June, 1831. Possibly at the edge of the crowd, possibly at home with the doors locked, possibly running an errand and caught in the streets when the firing started. We do not know. We do know that the family of any colliery boy born in Merthyr in the early 1830s was a family whose adults had watched the town be taken back from them by force 10 years earlier, and that the streets where the boy walked to work in 1841 were the same streets that the bodies had been carried through in 1831, and that the moral atmosphere of a Merthyr working-class household in his childhood was an atmosphere shaped in ways that nobody had to articulate aloud by the memory of those days. The historian Gwyn Alfred Williams, who spent the second half of his career writing about the Rising, settled on a formulation that the Welsh historiography of the working class has not improved on in the half-century since. Before Merthyr, he wrote, there had been workers in Wales. After Merthyr, there was a Welsh working class. The events of 1831 had transformed a population of individual men, selling their labour into a collective conscious of itself as a class, capable of independent political action, willing to take and hold a town against the might of the British state, and prepared to mourn and remember its dead. Phillip Phillips was a child of this transformed population. He was 9 years old, scarred on his face, sitting at a wooden door 300 feet underground for 5 pence a day, in a town that had carried a red flag through its streets the year before he was conceived. The court records that preserved the testimony of Dick Penderyn at his trial in July 1831, and the court records that preserved the deposition of Phillip Phillips before the Children's Employment Commissioner 10 years later, are held today in the same archive. They are catalogued by date, by case number, by district. A researcher working in the Welsh history collections of the National Library at Aberystwyth, or in the parliamentary papers at the British Library in London, can request both of them and read them on the same afternoon. The volumes sit on the same shelves. The boy at the door in 1841 and the man on the scaffold in 1831 belong in the long catalogue of the Welsh 19th century to the same sequence of records about the same town and the same class of people. They are not adjacent exactly. They are part of the same continuous document, kept by the same state about the same place, over the same lifetime. The lifetime, in Philip's case, had not yet really begun. The man who walked into the Plymouth pits with a notebook in the late summer of 1841 was 33 years old, English by birth, and had been working as a sub-commissioner of the Children's Employment Commission for less than a year. His name was Robert Hugh Franks, and almost everything we know about him as a person comes from the reports he wrote. The South Wales Report on the Collieries and Ironworks, which is the volume that carries Phillip's deposition, and a separate report he produced on the conditions of children working in the Scottish coal mines, which he visited the same year. Beyond the reports, he is a thin figure in the historical record. He does not appear in the standard biographical dictionaries of the period in any detail. The dates of his birth and death are uncertain enough that different sources give different years for both. He had worked, before his appointment to the commission, as an inspector for the Poor Law Administration, which is to say that he had spent the late 1830s walking around English workhouses observing the conditions in which the destitute were being kept, and had brought to his Welsh and Scottish work a particular kind of attention that the Poor Law Inspectorate had trained into its men. He noticed things. He wrote them down. He did not make them more dramatic on the page than he had found them on the ground. What he had been asked to do in the spring of 1841 was to visit the iron and coal districts of South Wales and to interview as many children working in them as he could practically manage, with particular attention to the youngest workers, the conditions of their employment, the hours they kept, the wages they earned, the state of their education, and the state of their bodies. The Commission's brief was not subtle, and Franks understood it. The point of the work was to produce evidence, public, undeniable, attributable evidence with the children's own words attached to it, that the existing arrangements in British mines could not be defended in front of a parliamentary committee or in front of a national readership. Lord Ashley, who chaired the commission and would push the legislation through Parliament once the report was published, had been clear with his sub-commissioners about what kind of material was useful. Generalizations about poor conditions had been available for decades and had moved no one to act. What was needed was specifics. Names, ages, hours, the voices of the children themselves. Franks set about getting them. Over the course of the spring and summer of 1841, he visited at least 40 separate collieries and ironworks across Glamorganshire, Monmouthshire, and Pembrokeshire, and interviewed several hundred individuals: children, foremen, agents, doctors, clergymen, magistrates, mineral owners. He did not announce his visits in advance. The legislation under which the Commission was operating did not require him to. He turned up at the gate of a colliery, presented his commission to whichever agent was on duty, and asked to be taken underground. The agents could not refuse, although the surviving correspondence between several Merthyr ironmasters in those months suggests that they sometimes tried. Anthony Hill himself wrote to a colleague at Tydfil that summer, expressing irritation at the inspector's manner, although he did not refuse him access. Once underground, Franks walked the workings with a lamp, often with an agent or a foreman accompanying him, and spoke with whichever children he could find at their workstations. He took down what they said. He noted the conditions in which he had found them. He moved on to the next station and did the same. The Plymouth visit happened at some point in the summer of 1841. The exact date is not preserved in the published report, which is a feature of Franks's methodology. He organised his evidence by colliery rather than by chronological order, and he did not see any need to record on which day he had spoken with which child. What we know about the visit, we know from the depositions themselves and from the surrounding context Franks provided in his commentary. He went down one of the Plymouth shafts. He walked the workings. He found Mary Davis asleep against her piece of fallen rock, and he woke her and took down what she said. He found Susan Rees at her door and spoke with her. He found John Rees at the coalface working with his father and asked him questions about his hours and his schooling. He found, somewhere in the same network of passages, a boy with a scar on his face, and he asked him how he had got it, and he wrote down what the boy answered. The conversation between Franks and Phillip Phillips lasted, almost certainly, less than a quarter of an hour. The deposition that resulted from it runs to 43 words in the published report, and Franks's own surviving notes on his methodology elsewhere in the document suggest that he interviewed children quickly, often in groups of 2 or 3, with a short series of standard questions about age, length of employment, hours, wages, education, accidents, and general health. The children answered as best they could. Franks wrote the answers down. The interviews moved fast because there were so many children to talk to, and because the colliery agents were sometimes hovering nearby, and the children were not always inclined to say everything they might have said in the absence of an adult employer at their elbow. What Franks did not do in his published reports is editorialise. The South Wales volume runs to several hundred pages of testimony interspersed with short factual summaries, and the summaries are written in a flat administrative prose that allows the testimony to do its own work. Where Franks does intervene with his own observations, he does so briefly and to the point. He notes that he found Mary Davis asleep underground and that her lamp had gone out. He does not describe his feelings on finding her. He notes that the Plymouth Iron Company employs 90 boys, 25 girls, and 80 women underground. He does not editorialise on whether this is appropriate. He notes that the youngest child he encountered in the South Wales coalfield was 4 years and 10 months old, and he names the colliery, and he gives the wage, and he moves on. The restraint was deliberate, and it was effective. When the report was published in May 1842, the testimony itself, presented in the children's own words and arranged colliery by colliery, did the work that no editorialising could have done. The reading public, picking up the volume and finding the words of children of 6 and 7 describing in their own voices what they were doing for 10 and 12 hours a day in coal seams under the British countryside, did not need to be told what to think. They could see it. They could hear in the matter-of-fact tone in which the children described their conditions that the conditions had been their normal life for as long as they could remember. The voices were unbearable precisely because they were not asking to be pitied. They were simply answering the questions of a man with a notebook. Franks's notebook, after the conversation with Philip, would have contained the entry that became deposition number 43 in the published volume. The boy's age, his colliery, his wage, his hours, the brief account of the accident the previous year, the sentence about the burn on his face, the note that he had been unable to work for 6 months and had returned to the same employment when he recovered. The notebook itself does not survive. The published volume does. The volume is in the British Library, where it has been catalogued and shelved continuously since 1842, and the page on which Philip's deposition appears can be ordered up by anyone who applies for a reader's pass and waits for the document to be brought from the storage facility. The whole exchange, from the moment Franks reached the door at which Philip was sitting to the moment he closed his notebook and walked on toward the next station, took perhaps 11 or 12 minutes. The 11 minutes are the only direct contact between Phillip Phillips and the historical record that we have any way of recovering. After Franks left, the boy went back to his rope, the door, and the dark. After Philip went home that evening, the inspector returned to whatever lodgings he was staying at in Merthyr, ate his supper, and copied his day's notes into a fair hand for the report. What Franks felt about any of this is something the report does not tell us, and the absence of any private correspondence from the period that might have shed light on it means that we have no way of recovering it now. He had spoken to several hundred children of this kind by the time he reached the Plymouth pits. He had found them asleep at their doors and burned in their accidents, and bent at the trams, and lying on their sides in 18-inch coal seams, cutting at the face with picks too heavy for their arms. He had taken down their words and their ages and gone home in the evening to write up his notes. Whether the work weighed on him by the autumn of 1841, when he was finishing the South Wales tour and beginning to prepare his volume for submission, is something the documents do not say. He did the job he had been sent to do. He did it carefully. He did not, like some of his fellow sub-commissioners, allow his prose to become declamatory. He let the evidence speak. In the days after the Plymouth visit, the notebook moved with him to the next colliery, and the next, and eventually back to London. Philip, at his door, would not have known where it had gone. He would not have known what would be done with the words that had been written into it about him. He did not know, almost certainly, what a parliamentary report was. He had spoken to a man who had asked him questions, and the man had written down his answers, and the man had walked on. From Philip's side of the conversation, this was the whole of the event. The notebook would be transcribed, indexed, set in type, and printed within 9 months. The boy who had spoken into it would not see any of those processes happen. He had a door to attend to. The notebook reached London in the late autumn of 1841, along with the notebooks of 15 other sub-commissioners who had been working in parallel across the British coalfields and manufacturing districts. The compilation of the report took the rest of that year and the early months of 1842, and the work was done by a journalist and minor poet called Richard Henry Horne, who had been hired by the Commission as the editor responsible for assembling the sub-commissioners' raw evidence into a single, coherent volume. Horne was a friend of Charles Dickens. He would later contribute to Household Words, the weekly Dickens edited in the 1850s. He was, by the standards of the editors, a parliamentary commission usually employed, unusually attuned to the literary force of the material he was working with. He understood that the children's voices, presented straight, would do their own persuasive work. He arranged the testimony with this in mind. The volume that emerged from his desk in the spring of 1842 was unlike anything the British state had produced before. It ran to several hundred pages of small print, with the testimonies of children grouped colliery by colliery, ironwork by ironwork, district by district. It included summary tables of wages and hours and ages. It included the medical evidence collected from the surgeons and physicians attached to the various works. And it included, threaded through the text at intervals throughout the volume, illustrations. The illustrations were the thing nobody had seen before. The British government had been producing parliamentary reports for centuries on every conceivable subject, and the convention of those reports was that they were entirely textual. Tables, columns of figures, paragraphs of evidence and analysis. No pictures. The 1842 Children's Employment Commission report broke that convention. It included a series of engraved illustrations prepared from sketches the sub-commissioners had made or commissioned during their visits, showing the working conditions in the mines as they had been observed. Children in narrow seams dragging trams along low passages on their hands and knees with chains around their waists. A young woman, naked from the waist up because of the heat, hauling a corf full of coal up an incline by a strap looped over her shoulders. Boys at ventilation doors, crouched in alcoves holding ropes. The drawings were not artistic. They were, deliberately, rendered in the same flat administrative style as the surrounding text, like illustrations from a technical manual. They showed exactly what they were drawn to show. Several members of the commission had argued during the editing of the volume that the illustrations were too inflammatory to publish. The objection was not that the pictures misrepresented the conditions. The objection was that they represented the conditions accurately, and in particular that the engravings of working women would be understood by the reading public as obscene, and that this would distract from the more measured argument the Commission was trying to make about regulation. The argument was lost. The illustrations were included. They occupied perhaps a tenth of the total page area of the volume, which is to say that they were not a centerpiece, but they were impossible to overlook. A reader leafing through the report would arrive at one of them every 20 or 30 pages and would have to look at it before turning past. The volume was published in May 1842, and the public response was immediate and unexpected. The press carried extracts within days. The provincial papers reprinted long sections of the testimony. Editorials in the Times and the Manchester Guardian demanded legislation. Sermons were preached on the report in churches across England, Wales and Scotland on the Sundays following its release. Workmen's clubs and mechanics' institutes held meetings to discuss it. Letters poured in to members of Parliament from constituents who had not previously written to their MPs about anything in their lives. The Commission, which had hoped to produce evidence sufficient to support a moderate reform bill, found that it had produced something closer to a national emergency. Lord Ashley, as the parliamentary patron of the work, moved immediately to convert the public reaction into legislation. He introduced the Mines and Collieries Bill in the House of Commons on the 7th of June 1842, less than 4 weeks after the report had been published. His introductory speech was 4 hours long. It is preserved in Hansard, the official record of parliamentary proceedings, and it remains one of the most quoted speeches in the history of British social reform. Ashley read aloud at length from the children's depositions. He read Mary Davis's account of falling asleep beside her ventilation door, and the Commons chamber, by the contemporary reports, fell into the kind of silence that does not happen in the House of Commons very often. He read the testimony of children younger than 6 who had been working underground in Yorkshire and Lancashire and South Wales. He named the collieries. He named the owners. He held the volume up so that members could see the illustrations. The political calculation behind the speech was specific and, by Ashley's own private admission in his correspondence, deliberate. The Commons of 1842 was a body composed almost entirely of men of the propertied classes. Many of its members had business interests in the coal industry. A direct argument that child labour was wrong on principle would have run into entrenched economic objections from those interests, and a less direct argument about the welfare of children would have been received politely and shelved. What Ashley had calculated, after studying the report carefully, was that the chamber could be moved by the issue of decency, specifically by the issue of women working underground. The fact that adult women were stripped to the waist in the heat of the deeper Welsh seams, working alongside men in the same condition, offended Victorian sensibilities about modesty in a way that the labour of young children did not. The illustration of the bare-chested woman pulling the corf, which had been the most contested image in the editing of the report, was exactly the image Ashley used to carry the chamber. Once the principle of removing women from underground work had been accepted on grounds of decency, the inclusion of children in the same legislation became a matter of legislative clean-up rather than a separate fight. The decency argument carried the children with it. The bill moved through Parliament with remarkable speed. The Commons passed it in the first week of July. The Lords debated it during the rest of the month, and it received royal assent on the 10th of August, 1842. The Mines and Collieries Act, as it became known once it was on the statute books, made it illegal to employ any female of any age underground, and illegal to employ any boy under the age of 10 underground. The penalty for violation was a fine levied on the colliery owner. The Act was to come into force on the 1st of March 1843, 6.5 months after passage, in order to give the colliery owners time to make alternative arrangements for the workers being displaced. The Act was reported in the British press, in the literary culture, and in the international socialist correspondence of the following decade as a moral victory of the First Order. It was widely discussed in Europe, where the children's depositions were translated and circulated as evidence of the conditions of the British working class. It influenced the second wave of European factory legislation in the 1840s and 1850s. It found its way indirectly into the imaginative literature of the period. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem The Cry of the Children, published in Blackwood's magazine in August 1843, drew its imagery directly from the report. Disraeli's novel Sybil, published 2 years later, used the conditions described in the volume as the basis for its industrial scenes. Charles Dickens, who, through Horne, had access to the material before publication and through his other journalistic networks had been familiar with the substance of it for some time, drew on the report's findings in the Christmas story he wrote in the autumn of 1843. The story was A Christmas Carol. The Cratchit family, the household supported by inadequate wages, the disabled child, the cold rooms, the bowl of thin gruel, owes some of its specificity to material that had been collected by sub-commissioners like Robert Hugh Franks in the previous 2 years. It would be too tidy to say that the report wrote A Christmas Carol. It would also be wrong to say that it had no part in writing it. The published volume, with its illustrations and its testimony and its tables of wages and ages, sat on the shelves of public libraries, mechanics' institutes, and private subscribers across the country for the rest of the 19th century. It was reissued in cheaper editions by reform-minded publishers in the 1850s and 1860s. It was cited in every subsequent piece of British mining legislation for the next 80 years. It became, in time, the standard reference for what conditions had been like in the coalfields before the Act, and it has remained that reference into the present day. A historian writing about Welsh child labour in 2026 still cites Franks's South Wales volume as a primary source, in the same way that a historian writing about Welsh child labour in 1880 cited it. The Act became law on the 10th of August 1842. It was, on paper, the end of children like Phillip Phillips working underground. What happened next, in the actual collieries of South Wales, was a different matter. The Act came into force on the 1st of March 1843, and it changed almost nothing in the actual workings of the South Wales collieries. The change it did not make was visible from the surface within a few months, and was thoroughly documented in a string of subsequent reports, parliamentary inquiries, and journalistic exposés over the following 2 decades. The mechanism by which the Act failed to do what it had been designed to do is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most quietly instructive failures in the history of British social legislation, and because it explains why the boy Phillip Phillips was, at the moment the Act took effect, almost certainly still sitting beside his door. The arithmetic of enforcement was the first problem. The legislation had created a single position, Inspector of Mines, to oversee compliance across the entire British coal industry. One man. The British coalfield in 1843 employed approximately 216,000 workers, distributed across roughly 2,000 collieries spread from the Forest of Dean in the south to the pits of Northumberland and Durham in the north, with the Welsh and Scottish coalfields in between. The single Inspector of Mines was expected to monitor all of them. He was based in London. He travelled by mail coach and, increasingly through the 1840s, by the new railway lines that were beginning to connect the industrial regions. Even with the railways, a thorough inspection of a single colliery, descending the shaft, walking the workings, interviewing the agents, checking the wage books, examining the children at work, took at least a full day, and most of the larger collieries took 2 or 3. The arithmetic was straightforward. 1 man, 2,000 pits, 300 working days a year. If he had spent every working day of his life inspecting collieries from the moment of his appointment to the day of his death, he would have got around to each one approximately once every 6.5 years. The arithmetic was bad enough on its own. The legal framework made it worse. The Act required that inspections be announced in advance to the colliery owner. The original parliamentary debate had included this provision on the grounds that it was unreasonable to expect a colliery to be ready for an unannounced visit, and the provision had survived into the final legislation despite warnings from some of the more sceptical reformers that it would render the whole system unenforceable. Those warnings turned out to be exactly correct. A colliery owner who received notice of an impending inspection had, by the standard practice that emerged across the British coalfield in the months after March 1843, between 3 and 7 days to prepare. What he did with the time was straightforward. The female workers were instructed not to come in on the day of the inspection. The children under 10 were sent home, or moved temporarily to surface tasks, or in some cases simply hidden in disused workings, with instructions to keep quiet until the inspector had left. The inspector arrived, walked the workings, found no women and no underage children, signed the relevant paperwork, and travelled on to the next colliery, where the same arrangements had been made. The female workers and the children returned the following morning. This was not a secret arrangement. It was reported in the local Welsh press throughout the 1840s and 1850s. It was raised repeatedly in parliamentary debates by reformers who had tracked the gap between what the law required and what the law was achieving. It was acknowledged with varying degrees of candour by the colliery owners themselves in their correspondence with one another. It was the standard procedure across the British coal industry for the better part of 2 decades after the Act became law, and it produced the situation that the historian of Welsh mining, Seri Thompson, has documented in close detail in his 2014 study of the children of the Welsh coalfield. The legislation that was meant to remove women and young children from the pits succeeded in the first generation after its passage, in removing them from the inspector's view and in nothing else. The numbers bear this out. The 1851 census, taken 8 years after the Act had come into force, recorded substantial numbers of women and children working underground in South Wales. Fewer than in 1841, certainly, because some of the larger and more visible collieries had genuinely complied, but enough to make clear that the practice had not ended. By 1860, an inquiry into Welsh mining conditions found that several hundred women and several thousand children under the age of 10 were still working underground in the South Wales coalfield alone, almost 2 decades after their employment in those positions had been made illegal. The Act had not removed them. It had simply moved them behind a curtain that the inspector, by the design of the legislation that employed him, was required to give them time to draw. What ended the underground employment of children in Welsh coal mines, in the end, was not the Mines Act of 1842. It was a different law passed 28 years later that did not mention children, mines, or coal at all in its title. The Elementary Education Act of 1870, the act that established compulsory primary schooling for children aged 5 to 12 across England and Wales, removed children from the mines as a side effect of putting them in school. A child who was legally required to be in a classroom on weekday mornings could not be sent down a shaft on weekday mornings. The colliery owners, faced with the loss of their child workforce by a route they had not anticipated, replaced the lost labour with horses and pit ponies, and the system adjusted within a few years to operate without the children it had previously depended on. The reform that had been designed to protect children had not done so. The reform that had been designed to educate them had. This is the kind of pattern that British social legislation produces with remarkable frequency, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it cuts against the story most of us were told in school. The story most of us were told runs as follows. A problem was identified: children working underground. A campaign was mounted by a heroic reformer, Lord Ashley. A piece of legislation was passed, the Mines Act of 1842. The problem was solved. The narrative is clean, satisfying, and morally legible, and it has the additional advantage of being roughly the structure of every Whig history of the 19th century ever written. The actual records of what happened in Welsh coal mines between 1843 and 1870 do not support this narrative. They support a different one, in which a piece of legislation was passed with great public fanfare, was nominally enforced by a single, overworked inspector who was required to give advance warning of his visits, was widely circumvented by colliery owners with the cooperation of agents and foremen, and was effectively meaningless on the ground for the better part of 3 decades, until a separate piece of legislation about education accidentally accomplished the goal that it had not accomplished. Phillip Phillips was, somewhere in the middle of those 3 decades, working through his adolescence. He was 9 in 1841, 10 when the Act came into force, and the upper age limit of the Act stopped at 10. Boys above 10 could legally continue underground work, and by 1843, Philip was no longer at the age that the legislation was even nominally trying to protect. The Act's effect on his life was therefore probably nil. He continued at his door, or was moved on to driving horses, or was promoted to working at the face. The typical career progression for a Welsh colliery boy moved him through these stages between roughly 9 and 14. And he spent the rest of his working youth in the same pit complex, doing the same kinds of work for the same wages, adjusted gradually upward as he grew. The legislation that had been passed in his name, on the strength of his deposition and the depositions of children like him, did not reach him. He had been the evidence the law was built on. The law passed over him. Mary Davis, who had been 7, was a different case. She was within the age range the Act covered. In theory, she should have been removed from underground work on the 1st of March 1843. In practice, the surviving evidence suggests that small girls in her position at Plymouth and at the surrounding collieries continued to be employed at the doors and in the haulage roads through the 1840s, on the days when the inspector was not expected, and that the practice tapered off only gradually as larger and more visible collieries came under closer scrutiny in the 1850s. Whether Mary herself was kept on or sent home is not in the surviving record. What is in the surviving record is that the Plymouth Iron Company, in its formal return to the inspector for 1844, listed no women and no children under 10 as being employed underground at any of its collieries. This was a lie. It was a lie of a very specific kind, the kind that everyone involved in the writing of the return knew to be a lie, and that nobody involved in the receiving of the return had any practical means of disproving. The lie continued in different forms for the rest of the decade. The point of dwelling on this, the point of including it in a piece of work like this one, in a chapter near the end rather than allowing the documentary to close on the moral high of the Act being passed, is not cynicism. It is something closer to honesty. The story most of us were told in school about how British society reformed itself in the 19th century is mostly true in its broad outlines and almost entirely misleading in its specifics. The reforms happened, the conditions did improve. But the reforms rarely worked the way the textbook accounts suggest they did, and the people who benefited from the reforms were almost never the same people whose suffering had inspired them. Phillip Phillips's suffering at his door in 1841 helped to inspire a law that did not reach him. Mary Davis's account of falling asleep beside her ventilation door helped to inspire a clause that was widely circumvented at her own colliery for the rest of her childhood. The two children who had given the report some of its most quoted passages were among the people the report did the least for. What did, eventually, reach them, what reached the generation of working-class Welsh children that came after them, was something more diffuse and harder to attach to a single piece of legislation. It was the slow accumulation of compulsory schooling, factory acts, mine inspection improvements, trade union recognition, and the gradual rise in real wages that allowed working-class families to keep their children at home and out of the pits. It took the rest of the 19th century. It is the history that does not fit on a plaque. The plaque, in the form of the Mines and Collieries Act of 1842, has remained on the wall where the textbooks and the school history syllabuses can find it. The actual history of how Welsh children stopped going underground happened in the streets and the schoolhouses and the pay packets of the following 60 years, and most of the children who lived through it never knew they were living through it. Phillip Phillips lived through it. He was somewhere in those streets, those decades, those wages. The record does not tell us where. There are at least 9 men named Phillip Phillips in the 1851 census of Glamorganshire. There are 11 in the 1861 census and 14 in the 1871 census. And by the 1881 census, the name has multiplied to the point where any attempt to identify a single individual among them is more or less hopeless. Phillips is the 3rd most common surname in 19th century Wales, and Philip is one of the most common Welsh first names, and the combination of the two, Phillip Phillips, appears in every parish register, every census enumeration, every employment record, and every burial entry of the South Wales coalfield from the 1830s onward, in numbers that make it impossible, with the genealogical resources currently available, to follow our particular boy from his deposition into the rest of his life. Some of the Phillip Phillipses in those censuses must, statistically, be him. He was 9 in 1841, which would make him 19 in 1851 and 29 in 1861. There is a Phillip Phillips listed in 1851 as a haulier at a colliery in the Aberdare Valley, and another listed as a labourer in Cardiff, and a third listed as a collier in Tredegar, and any of those 3 could be our Philip, or none of them. The 1841 census itself, taken in June of that year, lists several Phillip Phillipses in the Merthyr district of an age that could match, but the census did not record street addresses with enough precision in 1841 to cross-reference the individuals against the deposition Franks took a few months later, and the colliery employment records that might have resolved the question were destroyed in the various rounds of company restructuring that followed the closure of the Plymouth works in 1880. The boy with the burned face is, almost certainly, on one of those census pages somewhere. We cannot tell which one. The likely shape of his life can be sketched in outline, even if the specifics escape us. The standard career path of a Welsh colliery boy who started underground at 5 or 6 and survived his first decade of work was to be promoted, around the age of 10 or 11, from the doors to the haulage roads, where he would drive horses or pull trams in the company of older boys and men. From the haulage roads, around 14 or 15, he would be moved to the coalface as a collier's helper, working alongside an experienced collier, sometimes his own father, sometimes another man who needed an assistant. By his late teens, if he had survived the falls of stone and the runaway trams and the periodic explosions and the lung disease that took the ones who lasted long enough to develop it, he would be a collier in his own right, cutting coal at the face on his own account, paid by the ton rather than by the day. He would marry in his early 20s, the way Welsh colliers did, to a woman from the same valley or the next one over. He would have children. The children would, in the generations that followed his, attend the schools that the Education Act had made compulsory, and would not, in most cases, go down the pit themselves, because by the 1880s the colliery owners had stopped employing children, and the boys of Phillip's village were going to school instead. He would have died on the most probable estimate that the actuarial data of Welsh coal mining permits, sometime between 1880 and 1905. If he stayed at the face throughout his working life, the average age of death for a Welsh collier of his cohort was somewhere in the late 40s to mid-50s, with respiratory disease, pneumoconiosis, what the miners called the dust, accounting for the largest share of deaths, and accidents the next largest, and the ordinary diseases of poverty filling the remainder. If he left the pit at some point and moved to a less dangerous occupation, he could have lived into his 70s. The deposition does not give us his father's name, his mother's maiden name, or the parish of his baptism, and without those anchors there is no way to follow him through the surviving records of marriage, burial, or census. He is in there. He is one of those entries we do not know which. What we have, then, is the deposition of a 9-year-old boy with a burned face. One moment of recorded contact with a state apparatus that wrote him down and walked on, and then nothing. The shape of the silence around him is the shape of the silence around almost every working-class life of his time. The records that survive of the working poor in 19th century Wales are concentrated at the moments of contact with institutions, the parish at baptism, the colliery at hiring, the magistrate at trial, the workhouse at admission, the inspector at examination. And between those moments there is, in most cases, very little. A man's life happens in the gaps between the entries in the registers, and the gaps do not preserve themselves. Mary Davis, the girl Franks found asleep beside her ventilation door, disappears from the documentary record at the same point Philip does. She was about 7 in 1841. There are several Mary Davises and Mary Davises in the 1851 census of Merthyr, who could be her, working as servants, or as laundresses, or, in one case, as a tip girl on the surface of a colliery. But the same problem applies. Susan Rees, the 6-year-old who told Franks that she ran home when she was hungry, leaves no further trace. Her brother John, who had been working with their father at the coalface, vanishes into the same statistical mass. Mary Reed, Henrietta Franklin, Evan Gray, the named children of the Plymouth depositions, all become, after the publication of the 1842 report, the kind of people who do not leave individual records. They fed back into the population they had been drawn out of for one moment by Franks's notebook. The valley they return to is still there. They are not. The Plymouth Iron Works closed in 1880, 18 years after Anthony Hill's death, when his successors found themselves unable to compete with the new steel-making technologies that had displaced wrought iron as the structural metal of choice for railways and shipbuilding. The works were dismantled in stages over the following decade. The collieries that had fed them continued to operate under successor companies for another 70 years, the last of them closing as a production unit in 1940. The valley emptied gradually. The terraced houses where the colliery families had lived came down in the slum clearances of the 1960s and 1970s, replaced by the council estates that today occupy much of the lower slopes of Merthyr Tydfil. Pentrabach, where Anthony Hill built his national school and his church, is still there. The school is still there in a much modified form as part of the current Welsh state education system. The church is still there. The Anthony Hill Scholarship, set up in his will and funded out of the estate he left when he died in 1862, is still being awarded. Welsh secondary school students in the classrooms of Merthyr and the surrounding valleys still receive small grants from a fund established by the man whose ventilation doors Phillip Phillips, sat beside. Some of those students, almost certainly, are the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the children who worked in his mines. The money that pays for their schooling came from the same accounts that paid the children 5 pence a day. The pattern is not unusual. It is how the wealth of a particular kind of 19th century industry tends to settle itself, over enough generations, into the institutions of a region. Phillip Phillips was a child. The institutions that recorded him for one afternoon and lost him afterward. The institutions that he had spent his childhood feeding, the Plymouth furnaces, the Cardiff docks, the railways the iron of those furnaces had armoured, outlasted him by decades and have, in their turn, also gone. The valley is quieter now. The smoke is gone from the sky. The ventilation doors are gone, along with the seams they served. There are children at doors, and in tunnels, and in mines, in other parts of the world tonight. The job continues. The boy at any given door is, somewhere, still 9. In the British Library, in the parliamentary papers section of the catalogue, there is a bound volume produced in 1842 by His Majesty's Stationery Office on behalf of the Children's Employment Commission. It is shelved with the other government publications of its decade. It can be ordered up to the reading room with a reader's pass. The page on which Philip's deposition appears is page 241. The deposition is item number 43. It runs to 43 words, in the small print of the parliamentary type of the period, in a column of similar entries from the same colliery on either side of it. If you read the page out loud in the reading room, in a normal conversational voice, the whole entry takes about 30 seconds. He told Mr. Franks how the burn happened. He told him how long he had been off work afterwards. He told him what he was doing now. He answered the questions he had been asked, in the order in which they had been asked. And then Mr. Franks closed his notebook and walked on, and Philip went back to his rope. The volume has been on its shelf for 184 years. In any given year, it is read by perhaps a dozen people. The boy with the burned face is in there. He has been there for a long time. He is not in a hurry tonight. Sleep well.